Now, I go to the other side of the street very quickly. Now, we'll now take the other side of the street, which goes from the Horseman Inn right up, and I'll come roughly up to about the post office, and to see that side of the street and who were the people who were living on that side of the street. This is a list of the people who were living in it from in 1839, and we're going from roughly as this, the post office all the way down. Henry Gray, Francis Flanagan, come on down that side. Francis, the second man up, sorry, the second name down, sorry, is Robert and Joseph Lowy, and they're sons of the James Lowy who lives on the other side of the street. Francis Flanagan is a baker. John Connolly, John Cook. Now, Mary Gillen, number 62, is a very unusual woman living on the main street in that she's a blacksmith. And I hadn't known a situation of a woman being a blacksmith, and some of them she's called a whitesmith, meaning she works in the shinier metals, copper and zinc and things like that. But she's down in many of them as a blacksmith. And I'm trying to go back to see if her husband was a blacksmith originally, and I can't find a man called Gillen, but she's down as a blacksmith. John Connell, I'll mention in a moment here, just remember John. Michael Ross, by the way, John Connell was a leather seller, he was a saddler. Michael Ross is a butcher. The next man down, Quinn, was a publican. Francis Boyd is a publican. Patrick Flynn is another butcher. And why are they all butchers on this side of the street? Because of the shambles. We come on down to John Smith, who's a publican, and John Smith was also an agent for some of the lines. And the next property is the shambles. And the shambles is where Malone's butcher shop was. And the shambles especially where animals were killed. Now, the original shambles is in the city of York in England, and it's mostly associated with pigs. It's where pigs were slaughtered and gutted out and so on and sold. And therefore, places which were butchers, where killed animals, was also known as the shambles. And the shambles in Castleblayney was Malone's yard, which is now where the shopping centre is in the middle of the town there. It's been built over. And the shambles is here. Now, if you look down through the list as we go on down here, we have 3 houses and then the shambles, right? And cattle were taken in. The whole place was set out in little stalls. You can't kill the cattle too soon because there's no refrigeration. So you have to keep the cows alive until such time as you meet, and then you kill them one at a time, butcher them up, and you're selling the things. You're selling the meat to people. Okay, sorry. Just can I go back to that in a minute? Sorry. And we go down after the shambles. We have Henry Carson, Edward Cooksey, lovely name, to Owen McEnany. And Owen McEnany lived in the house just past McManus's pub, what's now the ice cream shop there. They lived in the next one. And Owen McEnany was another blacksmith, but his forge was down Short's yard, right? And Owen McEnany is a direct ancestor of Seamus McEnany out of Cavanagilla. And the McEnanys have been in the town for at least 200 years. And they came as blacksmiths and were in one of the business premises there just below Short's. And they had their forge up the gateway. And that's him there, Owen. Coming on down, Hannah Whitby owned quite an amount of property in the town, including land there. She owned property in the square, and the Whitbys were one of the earlier families to come into the town. In 1861, by the way, you'll notice here, the Belfast Bank has been built, which is the Allied Irish Bank. We now come down from roughly the post office on down that side of the street. And Mary Gillen is still there. And she's got a house, a forge, offices, yard, and a small garden. So somewhere at the back of roughly Corrigan's there, she's got a forge, and she's a blacksmith, and she's been in the town for 30 or 40 years as a blacksmith. I'd like to have met her, I'd like to have heard what her story is, but she has the forge anyway. Patrick Kelly, Robert Fleming, John Carraher, Francis Boyd, the publican, comes next. And then we have the house lived in by John Pearce, who is a solicitor, and that would be where Hughes' shop is, and then we move to the Belfast Banking Company, which is the Allied Irish Bank today. Eventually the bank buy the property above them and extend the bank into the little, little extension it has today. Going on down we see Cooney. Thomas Sheridan owns the Railway Hotel. Now again, he's a publican, probably gives meals to people, he's an eating house. He's not a hotel in the sense that we would describe it as a hotel, but it's quite a big business premises, Thomas Sheridan's pub. McIlerney, James Heenan is another butcher, and he's a bit further down the street. Richard Mitchell is the man now who owns the Shambles. And he's in charge of the Shambles, and he makes money simply by charging people. He kills the cattle for them, he's got butchers in there and they're working away. And the Shambles is good business to have. And Mitchell is also interesting because he also owns the lease on the Bridewell, which is the jail up York Street. So when prisoners are taken in and put into cells, Mitchell's the turnkey, he's the jailer. And he's also got a lease on the Shambles as well. So he's making money all sorts of different ways by locking up people in York Street and locking up cattle in the main street, and the Shambles is where the butchering takes place and the meat for the town is being produced. This is the first ever lease to the Shambles, and it's given to a man called William Lures. He's one of the Lures family who own the brewery up on Laurel Hill. He's given a plot of ground and half the profits of the Shambles, weighing and selling of cattle. Now, he gets half the profits, of course Lord Blaney gets the other half of the profits. And the people who live next to him, to the north of him, that's behind him, is William Hamilton. Mrs. Lures to his left. The street is known as Monaghan Street, not West Street. And on his right-hand side, what shop is to the right-hand side of the Shambles? Was that McGahan's? Yeah. Patrick McMahon is living in that, and then was taken over by Charles Malloy, and they have a shop on that side. But that plot was made about 1817, and the Shambles has been there for over 200 years. And here you can see the Shambles, all the cubicles where the cattle were put into, an open shed here where you could also stand the cattle up in, and I assume at the back here they had an abattoir, or the place where they slit them. Okay? Here we have the Railway Hotel, Thomas Sheridan's pub. Really it's a pub rather than a hotel. And these are the people who live in the lower half of Main Street, right down past McManus's pub on down to Short's Butchers that side. Felix MacDonald, who's also a butcher, William Miller, Owen McEnany and James McEnany are blacksmiths, and that's Seamus McEnany's sending. Hannah Whitby is still there, Patrick Duffy, right on down to the man at the bottom, the Reverend John Houston. And the Reverend John Houston built and lived in the house, which is now Mary Flanagan's surgery. And the Reverend John Houston was the Presbyterian minister at Broomfield, the Oglish church on the left-hand side of Broomfield as you go out. And the Reverend Houston, I think, is the man who built that house and lived there at the end of Main Street. Now, this, of course, is one of the most prominent buildings in the town, which is no longer, unfortunately, in use. Now, the one to look at is the one to the right-hand side, J. Mulligan. And this is Joe Mulligan's saddler's shop. Now, in 1861, the man living in this was a man called John Connell. Now, John Connell, as well as being a saddler in public, was a centre in private. A centre is the man who organises the Fenian Circle in the town, the secret Irish Republican Brotherhood. And Connell was the man who was in charge of the Fenians in the town. Now, we had quite a number of Fenians. The Grants were Fenians, the Carberrys were Fenians, and it was secret, of course, secret society, but Connell was the centre. And one morning, about 1868, about 40 policemen came and surrounded Connell's shop. He was a saddler in Mulligan's shop. and they surrounded the building and they arrested poor John Connell, and there was great commotions as they dragged out John and took him away. I don't know if John ended up in Australia or Mountjoy Jail or Kilmainham Jail, but John never came back to the town. He was arrested, convicted of having been at Slane Hill during the rebellion of 1867 and of being an organiser, a centre for the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and John disappears. And then a man called Paddy Mulligan, who lived just opposite Aniala Chapel, their farm, Mulligan's farm, was out in Aniala, and Paddy Mulligan comes in and takes the lease on that property. Now his son Joe then is the J. Mulligan, right? Sean Mulligan then, and Desi Mulligan Paul is the Mulligans, and they were saddlers. And he takes over the saddling business. I assume Lord Blaney confiscated all John Connell's equipment, right? And then it was there, and then when Mulligan took it over, he becomes a saddler, and for years the Mulligans were the big saddlers and leather sellers in the town. Next door to Mulligan's, to the right there, was a man called Sloane, who had moved up from Muckna Street, and he was a printer. And he printed posters, and he printed not necessarily books, but the posters that were put for advertising auctions and advertising concerts and so on. And then when Sloane dies, Mulligan's buy the print works. So Mulligan's now are not only saddlers. Paddy Mulligan, the son, now becomes a printer. And McNeil's worked, Pat McNeil's father worked for Mulligan's and became known as the printer McNeil's, because they worked in the print shop for Mulligan's. And Mulligan sold newspapers and had a print shop in the second shop, but still had the saddlering business in the first shop. And of course today they have the third shop, I think, as well. There were two small shops where the post office is. There were two small businesses, but if you look at the one on the left of the post office, it is Quinn's Confectionery, right? And it's a two-storey house there today. It's a three-storey one. So there it's a two-storey house. It's a three-storey house today. That's Harry Brannan's pub. This a photograph, and somebody sometime will maybe get all the names on this. This is the staff of the post office, taken about 1970 something, right? Including postmen, telephonists, telegram boys, everybody you can imagine is in this. You have a couple of the postmaster and older postmasters at the front here. I see Kevin Comiskey at the back here, Stevie Sewell, Christy Fisher, Patsy Mason, Peter McGoldrick's there somewhere. Yeah. And all of these people are the people who are the total post office staff. Now, I don't know how many work in the post office today, but there's certainly nothing close to that. And it does show it's a big industry in the town and taking in a lot of wages. Right. Now, going down the street fairly quickly, we're running here to 12:30. John Mulligan is a harness maker in Mulligan's shop. The next two houses are where the post office was. Now, the post office wasn't built until 1910, so in 1901 there were two shops. My great-grandfather, Francis Burns the tailor, is in the first one, right? And in the second one is John Duffy, a carpenter. And people may know the John Duffy connection. They are the Paddy Jacks, which would be Richie Moore's grandfather, Duffy's, and they were in the second. When Edward McArdle decided to sell the site to the government to build a post office in, they got evicted and had to move then to other properties in the town. We moved down to the square and the Duffys moved up to the other side of Main Street. Kate Quinn is the confectioner, and we saw the photograph of her shop. Peter Daly is a baker in what is today Ethne Hughes's shop. And then Henry Maturin is the manager in the bank, the Belfast Bank as was. And keep going on down. Thomas Pedlow is a draper, and probably one of the last Methodists that we had in the town. He was a Methodist. And his whole family's there. What's interesting about the shop is he's got 4 draper's assistants, right? 2 boys and 2 girls. Now that's a big business where he's employing, where he has 4 between shop girls and shop boys in his business. And he's also got a domestic servant as well. Tommy Sheridan comes next door, and Tommy's a shopkeeper. That's Johnny Murray's pub, should we say?
We had a massive field at the back of our house.
Sorry?
We had a very long paddock.
Yes.
We had a massive paddock at the back.
Yeah.
And Angela particularly and those, when they were young, at the back of all those houses on Main Street, we could go down to the paddock and we could down a little alleyway with trees on it, down as far as Abe McCabe's, right down to the Hope Arms. So we didn't have to go out in the street. That was the means of, and then that, of course. And
the field at the back was known as Crozier's Fields.
No, the field at the back.
The big field was Crozier's Fields.
And then we could go into McGahon's and places like that from it.
Now, going on down here, Brian McIlerney is a nail maker. All right, John Walsh, and then of course Patrick McGahan.
Yes.
And he as well has a big drapery shop, and he's employing at least 2 assistants in it. And he's got 2 sons in it. And McGahans were one of the bigger drapery premises in the town next door, and with Pedlows above them. Then comes Patrick O'Rourke. Patrick Carraher, who's the Carraher connection again. That's Uncle Tom Carraher's pub. As you go further up the street. You then have Charles MacDonald, who was a butcher, Charlie Flanagan, Mary McGrath, who's Liam McGrath's grandmother, and she ran a ladies' milliner drapery shop in, didn't she?
Yes.
No?
Yeah.
She's a drapery, right? Okay. Now, Mary McGrath's husband, who'd be Liam McGrath's grandfather, came to County Monaghan, I think from Kildare, as an engineer in McKean's Mill out at Lara. And then there were huge strikes out at McKean's Mill. There was a lot of disruptions out there. And eventually the mill closed. And he, with his eldest son, emigrated to America, right? And never came back. And she was left here in the town with the rest of the family, including Willie, who should be on that, and Pete and Alan, right? One of the great stories of Pete McGrath is in 1907, the first ever county final was to be played up on the Laurel Hill between Castleblayney Fogs and Monaghan Harps. And on the morning at 8 o'clock, the heavens opened and there were thunderstorms and they thought the world was ending, so they cancelled the football match. Everybody went away off the runway, and then by 11 o'clock the sun came out. It was a lovely day, so they decided to put the game back on. So they contacted Monaghan to come in their Sharabang and play the final. But Mickey Loughran, the Knockagolish Yankee himself, out at Cavanagilla there, Patsy Loughran's connection, Mickey Loughran decided to go off hunting with his dogs. So William McGrath came along and got Pete out and told him, get on the bike and out you go to Knockagolish. And he settled around Knockagolish. He was trying to find Mickey Loughran to get him to come back from the hunting and come in and play the football match, which he did. And they won.
Where was the field at Laurel Hill?
The telephone exchange at the bottom of the hill there. That was the athletics grounds, which they didn't use that often. Emily Quinn is there, Patrick Duffy, Patrick Malone. Now the Malones, another of the interesting families of the town, who are still there today in the same property in the main street and have been there in 1901 and were there from about the 1870s. Most of the Catholic families who come into the town tend to come after the famine. So sort of between 1860 and 1880, you get a drift of them coming into the town, more so than say before the famine.
Michael, where Malone's is, and then where the Chinese shop are, is it the
Lynn's, that's she's
that used to be Mary Jane McShane's.
Yes, that's Mary.
And there were grass tennis courts behind that place, because that's where Mommy played her tennis.
Yes, Mary Jane McShane was very posh.
Oh, yeah.
Well, she was actually Duffy. Her mother, was Duffy. She was born Duffy. And her mother married a man called John Duffy. I can't find out John Duffy anywhere, even though they're sort of half related to us. And Mary Jane was there, and she was very posh. Yeah. And she had a tea rooms, but only certain people were allowed into the tea rooms to have their tea. And at the back, she had a tennis court, but only certain people were allowed to come and play in the tennis court. And Mary Jane, and I knew her well, but she didn't marry Hugh McShane till much later in life. She was quite old when she got married, and she married Hugh McShane, who had a pub down Muckner Street, and she was really the posh. She would come down to visit us and had to get the best delf and the best china was sent out from her. And there's a very good story told. I shouldn't be telling this, but If you're related to any of these people, don't listen, okay? And Mary Jane, anyway, Mrs. Feeney was getting married. Mrs. Feeney was Duffy as well, and was related to Mary Jane. So she went to Mary Jane to see would Mary Jane act as her bridesmaid at the wedding, right? Now Mary Jane reckoned she was a spinster and was too old to be going to act as a bridesmaid at a wedding. So they decided to pick a woman in the town, and they went down to my aunt Katie, right? Now Katie decided she wouldn't do it either because she was too old and she was a spinster as well. So they came to my father's sister Molly, who was only about 19, and Molly would do anything. If there's a bit of crack to be done, Molly would do it. So they asked Molly to do the bridesmaid. Now Rose Duffy, Feeney later on, worked in McGahan's draper shop. So anyway, Molly was going to be the bridesmaid, and Rose Feeney told her, come up to McGahan's and pick a lovely hat for yourself to be the bridesmaid at the wedding. So that was grand anyway, and Molly went up and the wedding took place in the church, and she had this lovely hat and was all dolled up, and the wedding took place. And in those days, the wedding breakfasts were at the house of the bride. So they went out to Duffy's out at Tullyskerry out there. And my Aunt Molly said it was the coldest day in the house. She said the Feeneys wouldn't talk to the Duffys, and the Duffys wouldn't even talk to each other. And she sat the whole afternoon and nobody talking to anybody. But she said what was worse was then the next morning she was down in the house, at least she thought, when Rose arrived down and said to Molly, thanks very much for the bridesmaid yesterday, and would you leave the hat back? So she didn't even get the hat from it. Anyway, shouldn't be telling these stories about people. And that was the posh end of the town as far as she was concerned. This is Thomas Sheridan. He owned the Railway Hotel. McGahan, with all his draperies, we have all these advertisements. And this was an interesting one. There was a huge meeting held in the Commons in 1852 in an attempt to get rights for the Irish tenant farmer. And a man called Gray, who was standing for election here, came and made a speech in the Commons in front of about 5,000 people. And huge numbers of people turned up. But when it was all over, they went down to the Railway Hotel, your pub, where they had the public dinner. And they had a big dinner there and celebration and toast to everybody and let's drink our glasses of port in Tommy Sheridan's pub, or if you like. But he called it the Railway Hotel. It wasn't really a hotel, but it had a big room in it that they could have a big dinner in. Now eventually, in about 1923, Tommy Sheridan had died. His wife took over the license for a while, and then she decided to sell the license, and of course she sold it to Johnny Murray. Yes. And Johnny Murray, brother of Owen Murray, uncle of, what do you call him, the teacher, Phil Murray. This is the first license that Johnny Murray took out on the pub, which is there just above Malone's, where Malone's butcher shop was. And Johnny Murray, of course, great footballer, won 3 Ulster Championship medals with Monaghan, and his brother Owen as well. Only Murray had a pub down Muckna Street, and he spent a little bit of time in Crumlin Road, 6 months for certain irregular activities. And Johnny, I don't think, did much like that. And Johnny's daughter, of course, married Stookie Kerr in Ballybay, and Paddy Kerr then is the same connection.
Did your brother marry Sheila Beatty?
Sorry?
A nephew, was it?
Yes, married. Nephew married Sheila Beatty. Yes, Brendan. This, of course, is one of the butcher shops. Not in the Shambles, this is the one further down, and a lot of butchers were along this area simply because it was next door to the Shambles and it was easy to get the meat, and they sold the meat, or part of the butchering trade. Don't know who the woman is in the front of it, but you can see Gagan's here and Hughes's, and then of course the next one being what's that, McGahan's. And then you have, well, we would know it as Duffy's, and the next one then is Malone's, and that's the Shambles. And I found it very difficult to get a full photograph of the Shambles to see what it looked like in its heyday. We don't have one. That was nearly the best I could get. And then you go on up the street to Tommy Sheridan's Railway Hotel.
Tom Carroll was next.
Yeah, Tom Carroll is next, and so on all the way up. You have all these 3-storied houses as you go along. When you get up, the last of the butchers, Paul Short then would know this photograph, I think. Originally it was Moores were the butchers, and Shorts then married into Moores, and it becomes Shorts Butchers, and it's is it the 4th butcher shop in the town? Now this is a photograph, one of the girls in this is one of the Moore girls. Do you know? I think it may be written on the back, unfortunately. It was a copy I had of this. Maura Riley gave me this. It's Irish dancing. And the Moores who were there, it was Moore's butcher shop that they bought from, I think, Charlie McDonnell, and then it moved in and still Shorts today. And in fact, of all the business in the town, we seem to have a lot of bookies and women's hairdressers and sort of things like that. But the butchers have hung on well. We still have Burns and Shorts. There's another one somewhere. Sorry? Quinn's and so on. Basically because they're selling fresh meat. Now, my father's list of the people who lived in the town, very quickly coming from the far side of the street beside the Lyric, was Frank Duffy's, and he was a coal merchant. Then Joe Rudden was a publican in the Horseman Inn. Ned McBride had a bakery where Mickey Burns's is. Paddy Malone is still there. This is Mrs. Quigley. Now, Mrs. Quigley, Mrs. Duffy, Mary Jane's mother was Quigley before she got married, and her granny was there. She was Mrs. Quigley originally. Quinn's Eating House, Mrs. McQuaid. Now, there was a sweet shop there, and this is Jimmy McQuaid's mother. Frank McQuaid's grandmother had a sweet shop there in the wee small shop as you're coming up the street from that end. Mrs. McGrath, dressmaker and so on, Mrs. Lamb. Paddy Carraher. Jimmy Mallon, the butcher, is now in the Shambles. Patsy McGahan. Toby Loughran had a wee sweet shop. Now that was Duffy's, I presume. Is it? No. What's the one there? Chambers was next. Yeah. No, it's the small shop that was in the Shambles. It was Toby Loughran's. Then Pedlows. Charlie Vance in the bank. Now Charlie Vance was the banker in the Bank of Ireland. 1 minute just more and we finished. Charlie Vance had 2 children who were twins, and they were the same age exactly as my father. And he tells the story of the twin, one boy, one girl, and about 1922 the girl died, age 11, twin died. And he remembers the white coffin being carried out the front door of the bank as they went off to bury the child. The man, the brother, lived until he must have been nearly 100 before he died. Yes, and came to the reunion in St. Maldives every year. And then I met him, God, it must have been 80 years after his sister had died. Now she's buried up in St. Maldives. And I thought that was amazing, twins that had been so long apart, if you know what I mean, that one had died at 11, and when I met him, he must have been 91 or 2 at least. And they were the Vances, and Charlie Vance was the manager in the bank, the Belfast Bank, whatever it was at the time. Peter Daly is the baker, the confectionery, Joe Mulligan the saddler, and Paddy Mulligan the printer. Now this is a photograph of Thomas Pedlow, and what's lovely about it, I think, to have this photograph is the fabulous door behind him with a lovely semicircular fan light. It's not there anymore, it's a horrible rectangular door that's on it. And on the right hand side then is Ruth and Hannah. I presume that's the grandmother and the daughter and children and so on of the Pedlows. Thomas had one son, Wesley, who became a minister in the Methodist Church. I don't know where he ended up. Did he go to Africa?
He was in England at a time. He was in England at a time.
He was in England, maybe, yeah. I'm not sure where he went. And this is him, I presume at his wedding, it looks like. This is the last. He didn't stay in the town anyway. The Pedlows then die out. He's the son who.
You know, one of the Pedlows married Keegan and Carrick Cross, and George Keegan, who writes for the Standard.
Yes, is married to a Pedlow, and there's a girl in Portadown who's written to me, and she sent me these photographs. She's a grandchild of the Pedlows. There are still connections. Online is great at the minute. We're getting
Did the Pedlow marry a Malone?
Not sure now. I'd have to check. Possibly, yeah. This is taken outside Heaver's chemist shop, of course. The 2 men you know, wee Paddy on the left and Tom Heaver on the right. Father Tom. Right. Then, of course, you have all the modern, and these are the 3-story houses. We have what was Junior McManus's pub, which is now gone. and you come on down. It's surprising how quickly these places have changed. Shorts are still that fabulous thing. Junior's always a great place to celebrate. County finals, anything that you won or anything that happened in the town, everybody would head to juniors. And this is taken outside juniors. Obvious characters in it that you know, including Bubbles McNeil, I see, who's obviously there. And at the back, Tony Donnelly, Mickey Prandy Duffy, Frank Hughes, Junior McManus himself, Cagney is there. Tommy Bananas at the back, I see. A lot of the gangs. And Juniors was one of those great pubs where you go drinking in the evening and drink all night and get your breakfast before you went home the next morning, right? Always a place of crack, definitely, with a strange, very funny clientele. This is a story of Benny Beecham. I'm going to very quickly go through Benny. Benny was a postman, and this story is he was going up the street during about 1921 when the area decided to arrest him. They took him down Junior McManus's Shorts Yard, right, which was then Arthur Kelly's. Arthur Kelly owned the pub, and Moore's, the butcher's, was on the other side. And they were rooting through the postman's bag to see if there were any letters from the government to try and find out if some people were informers and were getting checks and money to pay or were sending letters. So they took poor Benny down the yard, probably roughed him up a wee bit, and then looked through the whole bag to see what letters were in it, to see if anybody was informing on them. But then they did something strange. They put the letters back into the bag and gave it back to Benny and told him to go off and go around the town and deliver the letters. So Benny went off and delivered the letters. Now Benny lived in St Mary's Terrace, up opposite the football field, and he had lovely roses and flowers round his door. It's one of the middle houses in that raised terrace opposite the football field. And a woman came to the town about 10 or 12 years ago with a photograph of her grandfather taken outside that house. Now Benny Beecham had a box camera, and every young man around the town who wanted a good photograph taken went up to Benny Beecham in St Mary's Terrace, and Benny took their photograph. And this woman wanted, thinking for her whole lifetime that her grandfather had lived in a lovely Irish cottage with roses round the door. And I had to explain to her, no, that's the photographer's house. He went up to get his photograph taken there. And about 1930, my father went up to get his photograph taken. And this photograph of my father was taken outside Benny Beecham's house. And you see the lovely flowers. It's lovely. I think there must be hundreds of those photographs, all of people around the town who wanted a nice photograph taken and went up to Benny. It was too much trouble to take the box camera down the town anyway, but it's a lovely photograph, and you think, my God, look at the house we had with all them. And when I disillusioned this poor woman that they didn't have flowers around the door of their Irish cottage. This, of course, is as it's beginning to look a little bit more modern and the cars are coming in. And we now see the remainder of Lower. And then, of course, when you finished on a hot summer's day, where did you go? You went to Mickey Byrne's to get your ice cream cone to cool down, and they definitely were the best ice cream. See, they're the best ice creams of all time. And the two, is she here? Is she here? She is. I see her down here. Mary is here. And the two ladies, who's the other lady, Mary?
Your cousin from England.
Oh, your cousin from England, right. And they're having an ice cream cone in Mickey Byrne's, and it's a time we would all remember fondly. Because the sun always shone when you were getting your ice creams in Mickey Byrne's. Thank you very much for listening to that nonsense.